Thank you all. Thanks for coming and good morning. I appreciate you all spending your mornings talking about such thrilling things as management. So I know those two words don't really usually go next to one another, but as an engineer, it was sort of interesting going from solving code problems to solving people problems, and it was infinitely just as interesting as the software that I was developing. So a couple quick things. It's always helpful to get feedback, continuous experimentation. I would love for y'all to tell me how this talk sounds. What am I missing? What are the holes that I need to shine a light on? So please rate the session and let me know what you think. And then please do that favor to the other speakers that you're going to be seeing today and tomorrow. It's really helpful for all of us. So as I mentioned, my name is Courtney Hemphill. I'm a partner and a technical lead at a company called Carbon 5. So we're a consulting company. We work with lots of different companies on lots of different types of software, all different stacks and deployments and all the good stuff, kind of like you just heard Adrian talk about. And what I found was that over time, I went from being an individual contributor, an engineer writing code during the day and doing pull requests and working with my team and planning stories, to slowly over time, leading those teams, and mostly leading on the engineering side, right? Helping to make decisions on deployments, helping to do bigger sort of architectural decision making. And then finally, I ended up, it almost happened overnight, I had a direct report. I all of a sudden was dealing with a human with problems, and problems that I needed to find solutions for. And there really wasn't a book that I could go to. There wasn't like an O'Reilly book for general management for engineering. So I was a little bit lost, and I was a little bit flailing around. So I really put together this talk because I believe that there are a lot of skills that we develop as engineers and that we sort of come to the table with as software engineers that apply really directly to great ways to help lead teams and to help to manage people. And then the other reason I have this talk is that, as a consultant, you get an opportunity to see dozens and dozens of companies, right? Hundreds of individuals and teams that sort of pass through the doors of your company. And within those, you always expect, the really brilliant minds from Google that have tons of funding from some VC. You're like, oh, that's that company. They're going to be amazing. They're going to do great things. I'm going to watch them IPO in 5 years. But that's not always actually what happens. And what you start to realize is the things that make great products, the things that make successful companies in this world, it's not the typical things you would think. Co-location, tons of money, resources, enterprise companies that have data up the wazoo. It's actually really great general management that creates teams that create effective products, and those products that create brilliant companies in this world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that situation and one of the complications, which is, again, there's not great resources. MBA doesn't really teach you to be a great engineering manager. There aren't a lot of resources. And then on top of that, hiring, as we all know, is incredibly hard, right? Hiring great technical people is hard. Hiring great managers of technical people and leaders of technical teams is infinitely hard. And then it's compounded by this sort of loyalty problem. So this is a representative software sample from the San Francisco Bay, which is where one of our main offices is. And this actually, though, according to studies done by Deloitte, McKinsey, this is representative of a lot of companies universally now. People just don't stick around as much. Average tenures are around 2 to 5 years. And so we really have this problem of attrition, really, really high attrition at some companies, and keeping talent around long enough to develop some of these skills. And the interesting thing is, one of the statistics that came out of these studies is that a lot of the time, the reason that these people are leaving, it's not because of lack of salary or equity or all of these other things that you would think are indicators. Clearly, that's for some people the thing. But the thing for others is that they feel that they don't have the necessary internal resources to develop their leadership skills. 66% of people, about 2/3, are leaving because of those reasons. And then the other compounding problem is that we fundamentally are working really differently, right? Adrian's talk this morning, how the old world used to work, and now we're in this new world, right? Smaller teams, continuous deployment, rapid evolution of software. We have microservices, and so our companies are looking like this. And equivalently, Conway's Law, our teams are changing, right? So we used to work way back in the day with teams that would be like 200, right? So you would have huge engineering teams. These were like 10 pizza teams, 20 pizza teams, I don't know. And we do. We now have 2 pizza teams, and we have a lot of those teams. And those teams are relatively independent of one another, even though they're interdependent with one another. But you need managers and leaders within each one of those teams. And so really being able to level up at the scale that these companies are now creating teams, it's hard if you don't have the internal great general management skills with those teams. So there's a gap, clearly. But what I find is the interesting thing is that that gap is not as hard to cross as we might think it is, right? Engineers do have amazing skills, and those skills can be translated over to helping to solve tricky people problems as well as tricky software problems. And then the last point I want to make, and it's a big one, not everyone needs to manage, right? So there is sort of this idea of a progression of a career of a person in the world, and it's this sort of tiered progression up to like the boss. But that's not everyone's dream of what they want to do with their career. So knowing that, recognizing that, and creating an opportunity for something outside of that is really important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience, sort of what I went through, and I'm going to use this as a kicker for this conversation. What I want to do is to give you guys some tools that came from some really inspiring individuals and mentors and companies that we've had an opportunity to work with. But I'll start off talking a little bit about me and actually asking you guys to interact a little bit here. I'm curious, how many people here are currently managers of humans? So a good majority of you. How many of you are individual contributors, you work on teams, maybe you lead those teams, but you don't have any direct reports? Okay. And then how many of you are leading teams of teams of teams of teams? So you're sort of like managing humans that manage humans. Okay, so a good many of you. Cool, so everybody's going to have their own story about how they developed themselves and how they developed their skills. This is to provide some additional components of insights and tools that I have found personally to be really helpful over time. So I started out as I didn't study computer science in college. I had a friend who was starting a company. At the time, it was called allposters.com. It became art.com. But I was the third person on the team, and this is where I learned development. So total baptism by fire. I was just making mistakes constantly, but I was learning really quickly from those mistakes. And over time, aside from just rolling up Britney Spears posters and shipping them out to college students, I developed my engineering skills. I then went on to do some sort of independent consulting, so I got to see other companies and what the difficulties and code looked like at other companies, so I developed my skills more broadly. And then finally I landed at Carbon 5, and the thing that I recognized there was that all this time that I had spent developing my skills, when I started pair programming, when I started getting mentored by these folks that had been in the industry far longer and with much more education than I had, it was like a massive acceleration of my skill set. So it was my opportunity to see what great leadership and mentorship meant for my skill acceleration, and it's something that clearly we kept moving forward with Agile XP pair programming practices with ourselves and with other companies. And then over time, I started to recognize, wow, I kind of liked working with bigger teams, and I liked leading these teams, and I liked working more directly with the client and the business. And then ultimately, because I started getting interested there and developing skills there, inevitably I was given my first direct report. And the day that that happened, it was the scariest day. I had no problem playing around and tinkering with computers and code because you're like, it's always reversible. There's risk that is reversible there. Whereas with a human, you're like, oh my gosh, it's like becoming a parent. You're like, holy crap, I am now responsible for a human who has complexity that is beyond the scope of any program that I've ever operated with. So it was a baptism by fire again, because again, there's no Stack Overflow, right? Usually I would be able to go on a Slack channel and ask somebody about questions if I had them when it came to the software I was working with. With management, there's no there's no Stack Overflow, there's no Slack, and there's no book to really go to when you're trying to solve these problems. But the great thing is that this is what I expected to happen. I figured it's kind of like what happened when I was developing. I started out and I was flailing, a Gumby. This is sort of a rock climbing term where when someone starts climbing, they basically are like flailing around trying to figure out how to move their body to just get up. This was me with software. So I started out pretty much as a Gumby, failing a lot, learning a lot, but then slowly becoming stable, right? Individual contributor, I knew how to code, I knew how to test-driven development, all of these great things, and then ultimately leading teams, then managing humans, then I was gonna be managing teams of teams, and ultimately I'd become the boss and, sitting in first class, flying around the world, whatever. The reality is, this is what it actually felt like. It was that everything fell down to you. So how many of you have experienced this, where you all of a sudden have so many reports that are directly depending on you to make decisions, to help with their career growth, to help them make decisions? Who here has sort of felt that feeling of the world is kind of falling down on you, right? And it's hard also because it's lonely down there, right? Having a one-on-one with someone where you just gave them some pretty direct, candid feedback about work that they needed to improve upon, and they didn't take it so well. And then now the whole team's going out for beers, and they're like, hey, come along. You're not going to go with them to go have beers, right? So this can become a very lonely place. And it's infinitely harder as you sort of go up in the tiers to find other people to talk to in a closed, confidential way about these really tricky human problems that are coming down at you. So this was something that I struggled with, definitely, right? I'm a people person, and I definitely like to hash things out in a verbal way. And yet, when you are having human resource problems, you can't always sort of just throw that up on the internet and ask people for help with it. So what are the ways that I found help? I'm going to go through some of them, and a lot of them were pulled from this recognizing that, I did have the development of skills within software that I could sort of look to find a translation into how I could start to approach some of these problems that I was facing when I had these direct reports, right? And so it was really just transitioning from one set of hard problems that were within code, complex systems, the architecture and deployment of those, and they got ever more and more complex, to dealing with human problems, individuals, teams, and the dynamics of those teams, and then overall sort of the organizational culture. And one thing here is that I'm going to try to kind of compare these to what I see to be sort of the core hard skills of software development, right? Open source programming, continuous integration, test-driven development, pair programming, which I've talked a little bit about already, doing code reviews, and then regular refactoring, right? So like seeing what's gone well and then refactoring the things that aren't going so well. And then I'm going to translate these over to what are some of the core skills for great general management at companies. And these are skills that I won't say I developed well, but I was capable of having some great people, these fantastic individuals that were mentors and some amazing clients with great cultures that I could pull from to sort of learn along the way. So I'm going to share some of those today. And I'm going to bucket these into sort of three sort of core needs that I see in great management at companies. And the first of which, and this is one of the hardest ones for me, which is basic communication, right? So we communicate a ton as developers, right? We're communicating when we're pair programming, when we're writing stories, when we're doing iteration planning meetings. But that kind of tactical communication, right, where it's very direct, the needs are immediate, even if you're doing sort of long-term planning, you're still sort of having a conversation that's contained and it's sort of conversational. It's very different when you need to deliver a difficult message to your direct report, or alternatively, deliver a message to the group, right? Or deliver a message up, right? You need to say, our group has made a decision about an impactful thing that we are going to do with the software, and we believe it's the right thing to do for these reasons. So these are concise arguments that you need to make, and that clarity and precision of that argument really speaks the worlds for whether or not you're going to get approval to do that thing, and whether or not your direct report is going to change their behavior and try to be doing better and leveling up their own skills. So one person that I'm going to call out here who is probably one of the least known but very successful investors in Silicon Valley is a fellow named Michael Deering. So Michael Deering is kind of a phenom. He's one of those people, when he sits up on stage, he just captures the imagination of really the room that he's in. And so he has a great storied past. He worked at eBay, he worked at Walt Disney, he started his own company. Eventually, he managed to get to Stanford, where he taught, and he was credited with having one of the most popular classes at Stanford. It was like 5% of the people that got into Stanford, of that 5% got to go to his class, and it was for entrepreneurs. And what he recognized through that course was that there was a lot of opportunity to teach general management to these early stage entrepreneurs. And so he started to both invest in them, as well as creating a educational school that he is now running under Harrison Metal. I highly recommend this class. If you have an opportunity to take it, it's called General Management One-on-One, and he really brings in a couple of these tools that I'm going to run through with you. The first of which comes from another amazing individual, someone who I consider to be kind of a modern-day hero, Barbara Minto. So has anyone ever heard of Barbara Minto or the pyramid principle? Nobody here has ever worked at McKinsey. It's sort of like a rite of passage at McKinsey. Anyhow, this is a technique that's great for developers because it's really a framework. It's a tool that you can use. It's very actionable, and it's procedural in how to create great arguments. So Barbara Minto is kind of amazing also because she was part of the first women graduating class from the Harvard Business School. She did not have an undergraduate degree, but her and 8 women schlepped across the river from the women's campus across the way to Harvard every day to get their MBA at Harvard and become the first graduating female class. So she brought to us this idea of the pyramid principle. And it's really an amazing way to start to practice communication, both verbal and written, to allow you to get the point across to people when there's a very confusing argument to be made, right? It's kind of the inverse of what we see in movies, right? In movies, you've got all of the details are slowly filtered out to you to keep you on the edge and suspend you until the end of the movie. But when you're in a boardroom or when you're in a tough meeting with people that don't have a lot of time, you want the inverse, right? You want to get to the point, state what it is that you think should be the resolution of that meeting, and then provide the supporting details. And just enough supporting details for everyone to be able to consciously and cognitively understand them. So this is something, she's got a book. Highly recommend that you grab it and read it. But this is the fundamental kind of underpinnings. And it's easy to put into practice in emails, in presentations that you do. Another sort of smaller version of this that I use a lot in emails when I've got like kind of a tough amount of information to get across to a team. Start with the situation, state it as it is. Everyone can kind of come on board because it's a situation that everyone understands is existing and everyone can agree on it. So you got the buy-in of everyone on what the situation is. And then you move to the complication. So maybe this is the thing that people don't actually know. Maybe it's something that's a surprise. Maybe it is the complication, the pain point that everyone's feeling. And then the question really falls out of that pretty immediately. And then you can either work with the group for the answer, or again, you can provide your supporting evidence for the answer. So this helped me a ton when I started to have to construct bigger and heavier arguments with both my team as well as to either clients or kind of like the partners that I work with. Another thing is goal setting. So this is another tool that is in use quite a bit in Silicon Valley. Started at Intel with Andy Grove, and then was brought into Google by a fellow named John Doerr. Has anyone ever heard of OKRs, Objectives and Key Results? Cool, so a couple of you. Have anyone put this into practice at their companies? Nice. It's not easy, right? It's super hard. So this is something that is infinitely hard. It has to be really championed by pretty much the entire leadership team and most of the rest of the company. But it's an amazingly effective way to go sort of beyond this whole notion of just KPIs. And it's a way to set something that really starts at the top from almost like a mission and a vision of the company and where the company is going to each and every level as it goes on down. So it's really each objective hangs on each other objective. And it's a great way for everyone on down to the individual to align what it is that they're doing against the overall company. So I sort of make this akin to like continuous integration, right? When you have everyone in an organization that is contributing in a way that is within and in a line to where the company needs to go, it really gives that force of direction against that acceleration that Jessica was talking about in her keynote. And it is hard to implement this, but what you're really trying to do is you're going very broad in the scope of what you're trying to tackle. So you're thinking big. If you are achieving 100% of your key results, which can oftentimes look like KPIs, you are actually not thinking big enough. So a lot of the reason that they say they use this at Google is they're trying to do a lot of really hard things. And so they want to shoot really big, and if they get 70% of the way there, they feel like they're tracking really well. Another thing is don't have too many of these, right? You're trying to be more about the quality of them than the quantity of them. And then finally, these are frequent, right? This helps to keep teams on a continual cadence. This is kind of akin to how we do continuous deployment, right? You want to keep tracking against progress, and it really helps when you have objectives and key results that you want to see in a more frequent cadence, but that are bigger than just sort of individual software deployments. The final thing, and this is a biggie, is you're never tying this to a bonus or a compensation. And the reason for that is it kills the culture of taking big risks at the company. So this is something that difficult to try out, but you can. I have definitely had success in trying that within a smaller team, and it really helps with individuals when you're having conversations in your one-on-ones about, well, what can I do next to really help this team and this company do better and to make myself be better in this career? It's a great way to sort of hinge, okay, well, this is the objectives of our team, it aligns to these objectives of the company, and your individual objectives and key results should be this. So it's a really helpful thing to help kind of architect the way in which you can work with your direct reports. So this is another big chunk of management, and it's culture. And this is something that does not take care of itself. It doesn't just evolve naturally. You have to pay attention to culture. You have to cultivate it. You have to evolve it. You have to think about it. You have to make efforts against it. And this is something that really does have business benefits in the end. So I think a lot of time people are like, well, the mission of the company or what we do is going to just have the culture net out. It's not true, right? And culture, if it's toxic, can do the same thing to kill a company as a bad product release. And culture is to great employees as great products are to customers. So keep that in mind. And one of the things that is interesting is that there actually is a lot of data that backs this. Has anyone ever heard of Google's Project Aristotle? One person? Okay. So this was basically two people. Cool. Google went, and as Google does, they took a huge survey. They went to executives around the world. They went to 180 of their teams across engineering, sales, marketing, the whole business. And they took quantitative and qualitative data from these teams to try to figure out what makes up great teams that produce fantastic products and great business results, right? So they were quantifiable in what they said as a successful team. They had metrics against that. And then they took the metrics against these different teams. And what they found was there were really 5 key components. And it wasn't things like co-location. And it wasn't things of, the smartest people in the team. But the topmost thing, there's other besides this, but this was in each and every one of the teams, was this notion of psychological safety. And what this really means is that these teams were capable and given trust to act autonomously, to have shared accountability within the team, and to have a very learning-centric culture within that team. And we've been able to see the same thing at Carbon 5. So we have done our own analysis with the hundreds of companies that we've had an opportunity to work with, and we've recognized that it really is a couple companies that we've seen that have just been outstandingly performant. And it's because we see them operate with this culture of psychological safety. So has anyone here heard of a company called Stitch Fix? So there's probably a lot of guys in the audience, but Stitch Fix is an online personal styling service. So this is one of those box companies. They send you clothing in a box, and you get to pick from, you have a personal stylist that you work with. They take a ton of data around who you are and what your preferences are, and then they continually work with that data as you work with your stylist and as you choose clothing. And what they are doing is really dramatically changing the way that clothing can be both delivered to individuals as well as how they can sort of assess what those individuals are excited about. And then how do they do it? They have 80 data scientists that work to really take and craft what fashion is and create algorithms from that. And they also have 3,500 stylists that live throughout the country that are feeding human insights into those machine learning algorithms. So it's a pretty complex process, and they have been wildly successful. So they have been in existence since 2011, and within the first 3 years, they were profitable. Last fiscal year, they recorded sales of like $730 million. So they're clearly doing well, but for me, what was most impressive was, yeah, that's great that you're financially doing well, but they have managed to maintain this culture through this rapid hypergrowth. And what we saw with that culture was this, they are very much in the microservices approach, right? And actually Randy Shoup, who was at, some of these, he's been brought up a couple times here, but he is now their VP of engineering. And so they have this micro platform, so they have individual teams that act pretty autonomously from one another, and they are interdependent, so they collaborate with one another pretty closely, but it's through sort of this API structure. And what they've found is that because these groups are capable of making decisions rapidly and deploying code continuously, pushing to production, They have been able to deploy experiments, try things out in a very lightweight manner. And if bugs crop up, they have a 24-hour team that's on call that grabs the bug. And if they need help, they grab the team who will come in and help them out. And so what this ends up happening is an amazing amount of development velocity. They can try experiments out, they can do it in a lightweight fashion, and then they can move on. And this is from the team layer on up. So it really has a ton of business value. And the other thing it has is a lot of value for the employees. They stick around, right? Because they get to see their work built on each and every day. So they're getting to see the results of their efforts continuously. And they don't have to sit around waiting for someone up on high to say, yes, I approve, go forward. So this is something that has allowed them to be amazingly fast, quick, and successful. So another component of culture is something that is, again, critical as a manager to start to understand more in depth. And this is this notion of mentoring. And I like to sort of consider this because it's what I experienced, is like a 360-degree view of mentoring. There's sort of mentoring to those that you are having as direct reports. It's also mentoring to people outside of your company that maybe you're thinking about hiring in the long run, helping to mentor up their skills, even as they exist outside of your company. It's also sort of peer-to-peer mentoring, right? Opening up yourself to getting, reception and feedback from the peers around you, many of which are doing similar things to you and are interacting with tricky problems like you are. And then finally, sort of being a good mentee, finding those people, those individuals that can help you find the tools and the techniques to help you become a better and better manager. So I'm going to talk, first of all, about this whole notion of kind of pairing, right? So we pair program, and when we pair program, we oftentimes find a better resolution to a problem that we have. We used to have a rule at Carbon 5, and we still have it. If you are stuck for more than 15 minutes on a problem, grab a pair. And we all know that, right? The second you start talking, it could be a rubber duck to start. It unlocks a lot of your thinking, right? So the same thing actually can happen when you're dealing with tricky human problems or organization problems, right? What does it mean to be able to hire more people of color at this company? Well, why don't you talk to your mentors in your network to talk about what they are doing within their companies and efforts that you might be able to try, right? So there's sort of three kind of versions of pairing. There's the journeyman apprentice. This is really sharing down. And one of the components of this that is critical that a lot of people let sort of slide is the one-on-one. How many people here do routine one-on-ones? You guys are awesome. Cool. So I don't have to tell you why it's so important. And it's not just important for the people that are reporting to you. It's important for you, right? You often lose sight when you are madly dashing around a bunch of different teams on what's happening on the ground. Your one-on-one is an opportunity to hear directly from your report what's happening, right? What kind of difficulties are they encountering? What's happening within the team dynamics, right? So that you can assess that and continually take actions against it, right? Another is sort of this driver navigator. Again, this is like the peer-to-peer. Again, there's no Stack Overflow, and it's really difficult to talk about sensitive information with others. I will highly advise you to go to, does anyone here know Michael Lopp? He's the VP of Engineering at Slack. He has Rands and Repose blog. Some of you have clearly heard of him. He has created this leadership in Slack, and it's a Slack community that is fantastic. And it's basically engineering leaders. You can sign up online, just Google leadership in Slack, and become part of the community. It's people around the world. I've done face-to-faces on this platform where you're literally talking to someone in Australia. They're having the same problems you are. And it's great because it's very, code of conduct is confidential, and you can get some great insights from people who are also managing big teams. And then finally, this apprentice journeyman. A lot of the people that I'm talking about in this talk were people that I worked with on a project, but I would go and have coffee with them. And I always felt really guilty about it. I was like, oh, these people are crazy busy. They don't have time for me. But the amazing thing is that they were sort of getting the same thing that I got when I had my one-on-ones with my direct reports, right? They were getting information outside of their sphere of knowledge that they could use in their work, right? So it's really it's a universally advantaged situation when you can find someone who their experience in life is going to directly both inspire and help you in what you're doing, but inversely, they're also going to be able to get information from you that's going to help them, keep up to pace with the crazy amount of development that's happening around them. So highly recommend, finding people that you really have a valuable relationship with and spending time to develop those with coffees and lunches and whatnot. And then finally, this is one that seems like, well, duh, be authentic. It's so hard, though. I mean, as you go through your work in life and as you go through these trainings and in these conferences, it's almost like your ability to just be a human gets like drilled out of you. So being a human, bringing your human version of yourself to work is really critical. And there's a great story by someone I'm going to talk about who created a book called Radical Candor. Has anyone heard of Kim Scott? This is a New York Times bestseller. Got one person here that heard of it. I highly recommend reading this. And it's no other reason than it's just this great of like, oh, I just want to put this into practice because I want to be this person with the people that I manage and with who I am at work. So she has a story. She's got, again, storied history. She worked at Google early on. She now is like an executive coach for Twitter and Qualtrics and Dropbox and all these other companies. And so she's, created this book that really is about how do you be authentic at work. And early on when she was at Google, she had someone who she was managing, and this person posed the question to her, how can I be the most successful person at Google? How can I advance my career here? And she just sort of looked at this person who had come out of like a Harvard MBA and was very structured. She's like, you know what, can you just show up as a human? 10 years later, this guy saw her at some conference somewhere, and he was like, that was the best advice I'd ever gotten. So I think at a manager, it's really important to recognize that it's important to be human, but to also know that your role here is to actually help people's career and to help them be successful, not just at this company, but wherever they go in the long run. And so Radical Candor is, again, a great tool for engineers because it has a framework, right? There's a way that we can sort of hang our thinking off of this framework that Kim Scott has created. And it's this notion of being able to understand how much you are caring personally about the person that is reporting to you, but also challenging them, getting them to be a better and better, engineer, ways in which they could be a better leader, ways in which that they could level up their skills. So finding the balance oftentimes is really hard. A lot of the time because we've been taught, through the course of our lives is, don't say something unless it's something nice, right? These sort of social constructs that are built into us from an early age. We have to almost battle that in order for us to come up with direct, challenging feedback for our reports so that we can help them to become better. Because otherwise, if we just sort of are like, this person that keeps showing up every day, they're on the team, they're doing their work, but it's kind of crap. And if you want to say something to them, but it's hard. It's hard to deliver that message because it's going to be difficult for them to take. But if you don't deliver that message, inevitably, you're going to end up with someone that's not contributing, and someone at some point is going to be like, we got to get rid of that guy. And you did not do your job along the way to say, hey, man, here's a couple things that you could do to help the rest of the team be better and to help yourself advance your career. So the other component of this is that this isn't really how it leaves your mouth. Kim Scott says it's not how it leaves your mouth, it's how it's received on your direct report's ear. It's important for them to sort of assess you as well. So you can actually give this, and I've done this, where you give this to people and you say, hey, I know we've been having these one-on-ones, I've been giving you feedback, I hope some of it's been helpful. I'm kind of curious though, where do you think I fall in this spectrum with the advice that I've been giving you? Oftentimes you can think that you're being radically candid, and in fact, you're actually being manipulatively insincere. So she's got a great book, highly recommend checking this out, and it's a quick read. Another thing is retrospectives. So this is really sort of like how you refactor your team, right? We all know refactoring your code base is critical and it's super important. Refactoring your team is just as important. And one of the ways that we do people here run reflections, retrospectives at the end of the week? Cool. I'm in good company. You guys are amazing. So at the end of the week, you get to see what went well, what didn't go well, and what can we do to fix that. It's interesting because when you level that scope up a little bit to think about teams and team dynamics, you still need to run that same sort of analysis, that same sort of candor that you bring to those retrospectives. You can actually do sort of a super retro. And one of the things that we started running at Carbon 5 a while ago was this notion of a product dartboard, right? So we really see things as products now, right? Companies are doing projects, perhaps, for infrastructure, but it should be in the service of products or customers. And maybe those customers are developers, but inevitably there is someone on the other end of the efforts that you are making that is going to receive what it is that you're doing. And what you're doing should have value, it should be unique, you should have respect for the other team members that you're working on, and really lots of other things. So we sort of identified 12 dimensions. We actually worked with some of the team from the Google Aristotle project on some of this. But it's an analysis that's sort of, again, a super retro. It's kind of scoping out to say, okay, team, do we all agree that we know what the unique value is of what we are doing? And if not, We need to sit down and have a talk about that, because those incremental decisions that are made every day when you're developing software and when you're making these decisions about business logic, it needs to be in service of the greater vision. And then the other thing is, if you feel that the team isn't capturing metrics, that you don't know actually how the work you're doing is performing in the world, that's a smell, right? That's a smell of a product that probably isn't getting the analysis that it needs to. So completing the dartboard is very much kind of a continual analysis tool, and you do it over time. You do it at the beginning of the project, and it really sort of helps to have some really difficult conversations around, well, if we don't feel that we're having open discussions, we need to address that, right? So you can fill this out, it's confidential when you fill it out, but then when you see the deltas between, some of the team thinks that your ability to have open and honest debate, and the other teams are like, no, I don't think anyone's listening to me, you know that that's something that you need to address as a team. So this is sort of a way to help course correct teams as they're moving along on maybe long-term engagements. So finally, I want to kind of go back to that whole notion of not everybody needs to be a manager. So how many people here still get to code or want to be able to code again? Cool. So I think it's really important to understand that there are going to be people that you manage within your organization that are not always going to want to have to deal with the human component, right? And these are hugely valuable. And it's important to consider this because the running paradigm is that the way that you advance your career, that you get more money, that you get respect and placement at a company, and that you would stay at a company is through this progression that inevitably involves management. But it's not true. There are two really paths that we're seeing a lot of companies start to put into place in a fundamental way and in a very transparent way across the organization. And one is the original progression that we've been talking about, this notion of you start out managing yourself, advancing your own career, then you're helping others with their career, then you're helping to sort of like manage against teams and the coordination of those, and then ultimately you get this bigger sort of 50,000-foot view of the organization, right? So that's one sort of scoping up. But the other scoping up is something that's just as valuable for an organization, can run completely in parallel, and it's just as respected of a track as that first one. And I think that's the critical component. Giving distinct titles, roles, and responsibilities for the people that are really going to be mentoring on the skill side and on the leadership side of engineering talent within a company. So having these both be seen in a company as options for progression of your career will help keep great talent at your company and also allow that talent to do the things that they really want to do, right? They become mentors that level up people from the skill side. They also collaborate directly with you because when someone expresses an interest in something like, I want to look into security, you can show them directly to someone who can help manage their progress within leveling up their skills within security from someone that's been doing it for the past 5 years, and they are sort of seen to be the leadership, if you will, the engineering management of that skill or competency. So it fits really nicely in with this whole notion of like tribes and squads and guilds. And I think it's incredibly important, though, to also make sure that people within the company understand that this is an option for their progression and that there's really sort of this dual path leadership. So that's pretty much the tools that have helped out me. There's lots more. I would love to hear some feedback if anyone has any questions. I'm definitely open to hearing if people here have sort of tricky situations that they are willing to talk about. But thank you. Feel free to get in touch. I'm Courtney at Carbon5, or you can reach out to me on Twitter. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have indeed some questions in the app, so I will start with that. I need another hand, sorry.
Yeah.
There we go. I think the last one actually answered it, but I will read it again. How to make the transition from being a software engineer to a leader manager? It seems to be two opposite paths that you have to choose between. So the sooner the better, maybe?
Yeah, so this is one thing that is the good news, is there are a lot of people that choose to go into management, choose to go into team leadership, and they're curious about it, right? They're like, well, what does that look like? Can I do that? And it's almost that thing, and this is sort of what happened with me. I'm like, well, I want to know what that's all about. That seems like a whole nother sort of nut to crack. It doesn't mean that you're going down a path that has no return route. You absolutely can find a return ticket back. And I think that there is sort of a critical component to keeping sort of your outside interest and really your ancillary work within the company close to the code. So when a bunch of you raised your hands and were like, yeah, I still touch code, I think it is important. I personally like to try and dive into a project, once a year if I can, and be able to contribute code. It keeps your skills relevant, and it also allows you to go back to being more on the sort of the team side, being a direct contributor on a code base. So there really isn't, you're not going to totally silo yourself and find that you're drifting away from this sort of core technology contribution that you loved when you started out. I will say, though, that sometimes people get pulled in that direction because they like it. They find that they're great at mentoring others, and that there's this impact that you get when you have a team of 10 underneath you, where you can lead them, you can help to clarify and clear the path for them to get great work done, and you really do get a feeling like you are contributing in a big way. And I think that the team really starts to respect and value the work that you're doing. So you'll sort of start to see kind of the benefits on both sides, but I would say I know and have absolutely talked with people that have been able to go into management for a certain portion of their career and then kind of revert back to being able to contribute directly into code and or advising on code.
Thank you. Next question. Do you have any tips on changing the culture bottom up instead of top down?
Oh boy, yeah, it's tough. But here's the thing is, the engineers are every bit of value that a company has, right? So your teams, the actual individuals at your company, are what your company is made of. And the culture is really the thing that keeps them there. So I think, happily in the media, we are now seeing enough examples of what happens when the leadership doesn't pay attention to the culture and they start to lose talent. So I think from the bottom up, being a squeaky wheel, taking the initiative, like there's a lot of conversations that can happen, particularly in Slack, where people are complaining like, if we just did this, if we had more continuous development, we're doing these 3-week release cycles, it's crazy, why are we doing this? Taking action to, create sort of a side project or a pilot project or coming up with an initiative and finding people to collaborate with you, multiple voices carries way more than just one. Start to build this from the ground up by doing it, by actually taking the actions, collaborating with individuals, coming up with potential solutions that you can say, hey, I think if we operate in this way, if we manage in this way, we are going to be a better company. And I'm going to do this initiative. Can I get buy-in for it? And it takes persistence. It's definitely not easy. And it takes timing, like figuring out kind of where within the company you can do this and with which groups and potentially at what times is critical, particularly if you're in an enterprise company. So there's cycles that you have to think about that are financially bound. But I absolutely think that this is happening. And moreover, companies respect this. Like as a company, we get so many enterprises that are like, teach us to operate more flexibly, teach us to do experimentation and run more lean, if you will. So they would be huge advocates if they had someone internally that's like, I want to build out a team in a different mold and I want to operate them in a different way. So I think you can do this from the ground up, but it takes a little bit of risk. It takes a lot of effort, I would say, and a little bit of strategy on how you can kind of operate within the bigger organization.
Okay, before we go to another more serious question, here's a question that actually a lot of people have here in this room. What's wrong with not going out for beer with your team?
So yeah, I pulled that example up mostly because I totally go out for beers with my team all the time. I mean, yeah, beers. But I will say that there's times where you'll recognize that it's kind of maybe opportune for you to step out and let them, just sort of be peers with one another. You can't, it's kind of like saying, oh, there's no such thing as like an authority figure. We're not a company that does that. We're not a hierarchy. We're a holacracy, whatever it is. But if, if let's say Robert De Niro were to walk in that door, everyone here would start acting differently, right? There are people that just have sort of a different countenance when they're within a group. And as a manager, when you have direct reports and you're responsible for their reviews and their progression, it's kind of nice for you to allow the team to have an opportunity to collaborate without you. So that's sort of what I was saying with that more than anything. It definitely doesn't mean that you shouldn't go and have fun with your, the people that you're working with and to have, again, that authentic relationship with them. But it's just, timing things.
All right, and now I will mix two questions together because I think they kind of get together. How do I get feedback from my team members that will help me to get better at managing teams? And on that point also, how do you manage introverts?
Oh yeah, good one. So the first one I'll take. What has been interesting to me, and another reason why I was like, it'd be interesting to have a talk on this and hear other people's thoughts. There's so much software out there now that's doing like 360 feedback and software to help you manage your one-on-ones. So clearly this is something that companies are starting to focus their attention on. So I would say there is software to sort of help get feedback from the team in an anonymous fashion. Some of it is a little bit cheesy, to be honest. It's like, you're doing smiley faces on a weekly basis through these emails that are sent to the team. But it's really nice to get a pulse of sort of how your team is feeling. You can also do, we do it in a lightweight fashion. You can do Google Forms and just send out these anonymous form surveys that allow your team to give you kind of honest feedback. And I think that's really helpful as a manager so that again, to that like radical candor graph, where is my, my reporting and my direction really landing with these people that matter more, right? Like every opportunity that you have to help give advice and guidance to the team has resounding effects for the company and for the initiatives that you're leading. So making sure that that is landing well and that it's understood and that it's received is really critical. So I think, it can be as simple as just a Google form that you send out, make sure it's like anonymous and that they clearly know it is, but you can also look into them as these software as a service projects or products that are out there. Oh yeah, and what was the second one?
How do you manage introverts?
Oh, yeah, I think again, it can be hard because you're like, well, I need to develop a rapport with someone, but I think it's really, they're going to be introverted, so finding the techniques that really resound with them, right? If they are very written in their communication, but not great at the verbal communication, then find ways that you can sort of interact and communicate with them in more of a written way. Maybe they keep sort of an objectives and key results in a log with you, right? Maybe they do blog posts or something like that. So finding out the ways that they can represent what it is that they need, the pain points that they're having is sort of the first component of that. And then I'd say the second component of that is, again, sort of being the human, recognizing that the way that you communicate might not be the way that everybody else communicates. And so, again, trying to kind of reach outside of your knowledge and, your own biases to figure out ways that you can better communicate with this individual. And again, whether that's through, tools, whether that's through emails, whether it's through written, finding out ways that you can communicate based on their worldview and where they're coming from and finding the empathy of sort of what they're thinking as opposed to what you are doing with everybody else.
All right, we have a lot of other questions in here, but I'm sorry, we ran out of time. Thank you very much for coming to the talk.
Thank you for the questions. Those were awesome.
And take a break.